I should have known something was wrong the moment a man in a neon security vest looked me in the eye and said, "You don't belong here anymore." The words hit harder than the heavy steel gate that lowered across the gravel road just as my old Ford F-250 rolled to a stop. The tires crunched against the loose limestone exactly the way they had every summer of my childhood, but nothing else felt familiar. Fresh black fencing stretched across land that had never needed a fence. Security cameras stared down from polished cedar posts. A glossy green sign announced Willow Creek Estates private community in letters tall enough to read from half a mile away. I sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel while the smell of fresh-cut hay drifted through my open window, mixing with the faint scent of diesel from my truck and the dry Texas dust swirling beneath the afternoon sun. My name is Ethan Walker, and every acre beyond that gate belonged to my family long before anyone ever dreamed of building an HOA here. My father used to say you could tell who truly loved the land by the sound of their boots on gravel. Mine had walked this road since I was 5 years old. I learned to drive tractors here before I could legally drive on a highway. Every fence post, every creek crossing, every weathered oak tree carried memories that couldn't be measured on any county survey. I had left for nearly 3 years while helping oversee bridge projects across the Southwest, returning only for holidays whenever work allowed. Then, 6 weeks earlier, my father passed away quietly in his sleep. The funeral came and went in a blur of handshakes, casseroles, and sympathetic smiles. Handling probate took longer than expected, and today was supposed to be the first day I stepped back onto the farm as its new owner. Instead, 2 uniformed guards stood between me and the front porch where my father had spent every sunrise drinking black coffee. One of them adjusted the radio clipped to his shoulder before walking toward my truck with the slow confidence of someone who believed he had absolute authority. His mirrored sunglasses reflected my own confused expression. "Name?" he asked, without introducing himself. "Ethan Walker." He tapped something on a tablet, frowned theatrically, then looked back up. "Sorry. You're on the prohibited access list." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I even laughed once, expecting him to smile. He didn't. "This is Walker Family Farm," I said. "My father owned it." The second guard folded his arms and nodded toward the sign behind him. "Not according to the HOA. You're banned from entering community property." Community property. Hearing those 2 words spoken about my father's farm made the air feel strangely still. Then I noticed something that turned the confusion into something much colder. The old white mailbox my dad had built by hand was gone. In its place stood a row of matching decorative mailboxes with polished brass numbers, perfectly aligned beneath the HOA sign, as though 40 years of family history had been quietly erased while no one was watching. The younger guard slid a laminated notice across the hood of my truck as though he had repeated the same routine 100 times before. The paper listed my name, the property address, and one sentence that made no legal sense at all. Unauthorized individual. Access permanently revoked by Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I read it twice before folding it carefully and setting it on the passenger seat. My father taught me something long before he ever showed me how to mend a fence or rebuild an old tractor engine. Never argue with someone who wants you angry. Let them keep talking because people who think they are winning usually tell you everything you need to know. So I stayed quiet. The breeze carried the sweet smell of fresh alfalfa across the fields, and somewhere beyond the gate, I heard the familiar clatter of an old windmill turning in the afternoon wind. That sound had been part of my life for almost 30 years. My grandfather installed that windmill in 1968 after digging the well by hand with neighbors who were paid mostly in barbecue and iced tea. My father never replaced it even after newer systems became available because he believed some things deserved to outlive the people who built them. Every Saturday morning, we walked the fence lines together before the sun became too hot. He would point toward the giant oak tree standing on the highest hill and remind me that our family measured wealth differently from everyone else. We did not count houses or bank accounts. We counted generations. That tree had watched 3 Walker weddings, countless family reunions, and more sunsets than anyone could remember. When I was 12 years old, I carved my initials into the backside of the trunk where nobody else could see them. Dad caught me with the pocket knife still in my hand. Instead of getting angry, he smiled and placed his own weathered palm against the bark. He said, "Ethan, as long as this old oak is standing, Nobody owns this farm except the Walkers. Land remembers who cares for it. I never forgot those words. Standing outside the locked gate now, I found myself staring toward the distant hill where the top branches of that same oak still rose above the rolling pasture. It was still there, untouched, stretching into the bright blue Texas sky exactly as it had every year of my life. Somehow seeing that tree brought more comfort than the deed folded inside my briefcase. My father had prepared for everything. During the final weeks of his illness, he insisted on organizing every file in the farmhouse office. Insurance papers, tax records, survey maps, water rights. He labeled each folder with the same careful handwriting he used when teaching me arithmetic at the kitchen table. At the time, I thought he simply wanted to make probate easier. Looking back, I wondered if he had already sensed something was changing around the property. The older guard interrupted my thoughts by clearing his throat. A white sport utility vehicle rolled slowly toward the entrance from inside the gate, polished so perfectly that it reflected the afternoon sunlight like a mirror. As it approached, both guards straightened their posture without being told. Whoever was inside clearly expected respect, and judging by the confident smile that appeared behind the windshield before the vehicle even stopped, she expected something else too. She expected me to leave. The driver stepped out with the kind of confidence that only came from believing nobody would ever question her authority. She looked to be in her early 50s, dressed in an immaculate cream blazer despite the Texas heat, sunglasses resting perfectly on top of carefully styled blonde hair. Even before she spoke, I caught the sharp scent of expensive perfume drifting across the gravel, strangely out of place against the smell of fresh dirt, cut grass, and warm cedar fencing. She smiled politely, but there was nothing welcoming about it. "You must be Ethan Walker," she said, extending her hand without taking another step. "I am Linda Crawford, president of Willow Creek Estates." I kept my hands at my sides. "I know exactly who I am. The better question is why your guards are standing on my family's road." Her smile barely moved. "Actually, this entrance now serves our residential community. We have invested significant resources improving the surrounding area." She gestured toward the decorative stone walls, the electronic gate, and the freshly paved entrance road, as though she were showing off a luxury resort instead of the driveway where my father used to park his rusted pickup after feeding cattle every evening. "You should appreciate what we have done," she continued. "The property finally reflects modern standards." I looked past her shoulder toward the distant red barn. Even from where I stood, I could still recognize the weathered roof Dad had repaired every spring without hiring anyone. Seeing it surrounded by polished fencing and professionally landscaped flower beds felt like someone had quietly rewritten my childhood while I was away. "Modern standards," I repeated. "That barn was standing before your subdivision existed." Linda laughed softly as if I had made an amusing observation. "History is important, Ethan, but communities evolve. Your father was becoming overwhelmed maintaining such a large property. Everyone knew that." The words stopped me colder than the locked gate ever could. My father had worked that land until the week before he passed away. He never complained about maintaining it. He took pride in it. Every fence he repaired, every pasture he rotated, every acre he cared for was proof of that. Hearing a complete stranger rewrite his life in 2 casual sentences made my jaw tighten. "You did not know my father," I said quietly. "No," she admitted, "but we certainly tried to help him." Something about the way she emphasized the word help immediately felt wrong. She motioned toward a neatly framed community map mounted beside the entrance. The entire Walker farm appeared shaded in the same color as every other neighborhood common area. Walking trails, picnic fields, future recreation space. Even the pond where my grandfather taught me to fish had been relabeled Heritage Community Lake. My stomach sank as I stared at it. Somebody had spent time creating this fantasy. It was detailed, professional, intentional. Linda watched my expression carefully before speaking again. "The residents have grown quite attached to these improvements. It would be unfortunate to create unnecessary conflict." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. This was never about landscaping or community standards. They wanted people to believe the farm already belonged to them. If enough neighbors accepted that version of the story, perhaps the truth would slowly disappear beneath polished signs, fresh pavement, and carefully printed maps. As the warm breeze rustled through the distant oak tree on the hill, I remembered my father's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me. Land remembers who cares for it. Looking at that old tree rising above everything they had built around it, I realized something important. They had changed almost everything they could reach, but they had not touched the one landmark my father trusted more than any document ever filed at the courthouse. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds came from the steady creak of the old windmill somewhere beyond the pastures and the soft clicking of the security camera mounted above the gate as it followed every movement I made. Linda seemed perfectly comfortable letting the silence work in her favor. She folded her hands in front of her and smiled with the practiced confidence of someone who had convinced an entire neighborhood that repeating something often enough eventually turned it into the truth. "If you have personal belongings to collect," she finally said, "our management office can arrange an appointment after reviewing the appropriate paperwork." I almost laughed. She was offering me permission to visit my own family farmhouse as though it were a storage unit. I reached into the truck and pulled out the leather portfolio my father had given me the day I graduated from college. Inside were copies of the probate documents naming me as the legal heir to the property. I held them where she could see the county seal without handing them over. Linda barely glanced at the pages before looking back at me. "Those documents may relate to inheritance," she said calmly. "But ownership questions involving community boundaries are considerably more complicated." Community boundaries. Another carefully chosen phrase. Every answer she gave sounded polished, almost rehearsed, as though she had practiced this conversation long before I ever drove through that gate. I asked the question that had been bothering me since I arrived. "When exactly did my family's farm become part of your community?" Her smile faded just enough for me to notice. "The transition happened gradually over the past few years through agreements and planning initiatives." Agreements. Planning initiatives. Not one direct answer. I looked toward the gravel road disappearing through the entrance. The fresh asphalt stopped exactly where my father's original lane began. I could still see the faint outline of the old wagon ruts running alongside it, marks carved into the ground decades before anyone dreamed of gated subdivisions. They had paved over history without quite managing to erase it. I pulled out my phone and called the county sheriff's office. 25 minutes later, a patrol truck rolled up in a cloud of pale dust. Deputy Ryan Collins stepped out, adjusted his hat, and listened carefully while both sides explained their version of the dispute. He knew my father by name. I could see the recognition in his eyes when he looked toward the farmhouse in the distance. Yet after examining the entrance and listening to Linda describe ongoing property disagreements, he let out a slow breath. "Ethan," he said quietly, "this looks like a civil property matter. Without a court order, I cannot force anyone to open this gate today." The words settled heavily in the warm afternoon air. Linda thanked him with a smile that looked almost triumphant. The guards relaxed for the first time since I arrived. Deputy Collins handed me a small card with the county case number he had opened for documentation. Before leaving, he leaned closer and lowered his voice enough that only I could hear. "Do not lose your patience. Gather every record your father left behind. Something about this situation does not sit right." As his patrol truck disappeared down the road, I watched the dust drift slowly across the fields until it vanished into the golden sunlight. Linda believed the conversation was over. The guards believed they had won. But as I slipped the deputy's card into the same leather portfolio my father once carried, I realized I was no longer trying to convince the people standing at that gate. I needed to understand exactly what had happened while I was away, because somewhere between my father's final harvest and today, someone had transformed an obvious lie into something that looked dangerously official. By the time the sun dipped behind the western ridge, I had driven 20 miles into the nearest town with more questions than answers. The courthouse closed in less than an hour, so I settled for the only place my father visited every Thursday morning after buying feed, a small diner called Miller's Kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeted me the moment I stepped inside, exactly the way it had since I was a kid sitting across from Dad while he solved every problem in the world over scrambled eggs and toast. A few familiar faces glanced my way before quietly returning to their meals. Some recognized me immediately. Others recognized my last name. Yet something felt different. Conversations stopped whenever I walked past. Eyes drifted toward the window as though nobody wanted to be caught talking to me. Mrs. Helen Brooks, who had known my family for nearly 40 years, finally slid into the booth across from mine, carrying her coffee mug with both hands. She lowered her voice before speaking. "People thought you were not coming back, Ethan." I frowned. "Who told them that?" She hesitated for several seconds. "Everyone heard your father agreed to let the community expand after his health declined." Linda made it sound like it was his idea. I felt the ceramic coffee cup pause halfway to my mouth. My father had never once mentioned selling, donating, or sharing the farm. In fact, only 3 months before he passed away, he had proudly shown me photographs of a new irrigation line he installed near the north pasture. Nobody invests that kind of time and money into land they plan to surrender. "Did anyone actually see an agreement?" I asked. Helen slowly shook her head. "No, we only heard about meetings. There were newsletters, presentations, maps. After a while, everybody assumed the paperwork had already been signed." Assumed. That single word stayed with me long after I left the diner. It explained why nobody questioned the new entrance, the decorative signs, or the guards. They had accepted a story because it had been repeated often enough. Early the next morning, I met with the first real estate attorney recommended by the county clerk. His office overlooked the courthouse square, filled with framed survey maps and shelves lined with thick property law books. He studied my probate documents carefully before leaning back in his chair. "You unquestionably inherited the farm," he said. "The problem is proving exactly what the HOA believes it controls and why they believe it." He explained that resolving the dispute could take months if hidden agreements, easements, or boundary changes had been recorded somewhere in the county archives. By the time I walked back onto Main Street, the courthouse clock struck noon. The warm air shimmered above the sidewalk, and I suddenly remembered something my father had done every single year without fail. Every January, he visited the county recorder's office personally, refusing to mail anything involving the farm. He used to joke that paper had a funny way of disappearing whenever it traveled too far without someone watching it. At the time, I thought he was simply old-fashioned. Standing there beneath the courthouse flag, I realized he may have been protecting something far more important than annual tax records. As I opened the leather portfolio again, a folded yellow note slipped from the inside pocket and landed at my feet. I recognized my father's handwriting instantly. There were only 6 words written across the page. "If anything feels wrong, check the workshop." The workshop sat behind the farmhouse exactly where it always had, hidden beneath the wide branches of the old oak tree that my father trusted more than any lawyer. I could not reach it through the front entrance, so I parked along the county road nearly half a mile away and followed the narrow creek that bordered the western fence line. The late afternoon air smelled of sun-baked cedar, damp earth, and wild grass, while cicadas filled the silence with their steady chorus. My boots sank into the familiar soft ground with every step, and for the first time since returning home, the farm felt like it still recognized me. The workshop itself stood untouched. The faded red paint had peeled even more since my last visit, but the weathered building remained exactly as my father had left it. One small side door, hidden behind a row of old pecan trees, was never visible from the main driveway. Dad installed it decades earlier because he hated carrying heavy tools around the entire building. The brass key hanging on my truck key ring slid into the lock as smoothly as it always had. Inside, the smell of machine oil, aged pine, leather gloves, and sawdust instantly carried me back 20 years. Every wrench hung neatly on its outline. Every toolbox remained labeled in my father's careful handwriting. Nothing looked disturbed. At first, I wondered if the note had simply been referring to the probate files stored inside the office cabinet. Then I remembered another habit Dad never broke. Whenever he wanted to protect something important, he never hid it inside a safe. He hid it somewhere nobody would think to search because it appeared too ordinary. My eyes drifted toward the old wooden workbench, where we rebuilt tractor engines every winter. Above it hung the same pegboard that had covered the wall since I was a child. I ran my fingers along the lower edge until I felt a tiny metal latch I had completely forgotten existed. The pegboard swung outward like a concealed door, revealing a narrow compartment built between the wall studs. Resting inside was a weatherproof steel tube sealed with a threaded cap. My heartbeat quickened as I twisted it open. Carefully rolled survey maps slid onto the workbench, followed by a leather document folder, several certified copies of recorded deeds, and a handwritten notebook. The oldest survey carried a county seal dated 1973. Bright red boundary lines outlined every acre of Walker family farm with remarkable precision. One detail immediately caught my attention. The entrance road where the HOA had built its security gate was clearly identified as a privately deeded access easement owned exclusively by our family. There was no shared access, no community roadway, no subdivision rights of any kind. I unrolled the second survey beside the first. It showed the modern subdivision built years later, stopping several hundred feet short of our entrance. Someone had deliberately ignored the recorded boundary that already existed. Then I opened my father's notebook. The first page contained only one sentence written in the same steady handwriting I had recognized on the yellow note. If you were reading this, someone finally believed they could change a property line without changing the truth. Beneath that sentence sat page after page of dated observations, copies of certified letters, photographs, meeting notices, and conversations documenting every attempt the HOA had made to pressure him into surrendering the entrance road. Suddenly, every carefully rehearsed answer Linda had given me at the gate made perfect sense. They had never been relying on ownership. They had been relying on everyone else forgetting where the real property line had always been. That night, I spread every document across the old workbench exactly the way my father used to organize planting schedules before spring arrived. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a warm circle across the faded wood, while crickets chirped outside, and the scent of machine oil mixed with the cool evening air drifting through the open side door. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger would only make me careless. What I felt instead was something my father respected far more than emotion. Clarity. Every survey, every certified letter, every county filing fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting years for someone to finish it. Linda had counted on one simple fact. Most people never read property records. They trusted polished presentations, confident speeches, and expensive signs more than quiet documents filed at the courthouse. My father understood that better than anyone, which explained why he had documented everything without ever making a public scene. The next morning, I called a licensed land surveyor named Daniel Mercer, a man whose family had worked county boundaries for nearly 3 decades. He agreed to meet me before sunrise. As we walked the western edge of the property with survey equipment balanced carefully on tripods, the smell of wet grass clung to our boots while the first rays of sunlight stretched across the pasture. Daniel barely spoke during the first hour. He simply measured, compared coordinates, and checked the original survey monuments that still rested beneath layers of soil exactly where they had been placed decades earlier. Finally, he looked up from his equipment and smiled. "Your father took remarkable care of these markers," he said. "Nobody moved them. The property line is exactly where this 1973 survey says it is." Hearing those words felt like taking a full breath after holding it for days. We continued toward the entrance road where the security gate stood. Daniel stopped beside one weathered iron survey pin hidden beneath tall grass only a few feet from the decorative stone wall installed by the HOA. He brushed away the dirt with his boot and pointed toward the engraved identification number still visible on the metal cap. "This monument controls the entire entrance," he explained. "Legally speaking, that gate was built inside your family's recorded access easement." I took photographs from every angle while Daniel prepared a certified field report complete with measurements, coordinates, and updated boundary drawings. But I still had no intention of confronting Linda immediately. Instead, I contacted a title company, requested complete copies of every recorded document affecting the farm over the past 20 years, and scheduled a meeting with a property attorney who specialized exclusively in boundary disputes. By the end of the week, another interesting pattern emerged. The HOA had filed landscaping permits, utility requests, architectural plans, and maintenance contracts referencing the entrance road as community property, yet none of those filings included an actual deed transferring ownership. They had built an entire story around paperwork that assumed something had happened without ever proving it had. That discovery changed everything. They were no longer standing on solid legal ground. They were standing on a very expensive assumption. I closed my father's notebook and looked through the workshop window toward the distant oak tree rising above the pasture. The same tree that had watched generations of my family protect this land was still standing exactly where the original survey placed it more than half a century earlier. My father had left me more than evidence. He had left me a roadmap. All I had to do now was let the truth arrive one official signature at a time. Monday morning arrived with a sky so clear it almost felt unfair. The air carried the clean smell of fresh hay drying in the fields, and a light breeze rattled the leaves of the old oak tree that still overlooked everything my family had built. I parked my truck along the county road just before 8 o'clock and watched as the first county vehicles appeared one by one. Daniel Mercer arrived first with his survey truck, unloading bright orange tripods and carefully calibrated equipment. A few minutes later, my attorney, Rebecca Collins, stepped out carrying 2 thick binders filled with certified copies of deeds, surveys, probate records, title reports, and county filings. Deputy Ryan Collins pulled in shortly. Afterward, not because anyone expected trouble, but because the county wanted an official witness while a court-authorized inspection took place. Finally, a white county engineering vehicle rolled up with 2 land records officials whose only job was to verify property boundaries exactly as recorded. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The only sounds came from gravel crunching beneath boots, measuring poles clicking into place, and birds calling across the pasture. Inside the gate, the 2 security guards exchanged uncertain looks before one hurried toward the clubhouse radio. Within minutes, Linda Crawford's white sport utility vehicle appeared at the entrance. She stepped out wearing the same polished smile I had seen a week earlier, but this time it faded the moment Rebecca handed her a certified copy of the temporary court order authorizing immediate boundary verification and prohibiting interference with the inspection. Linda skimmed the first page before looking toward the survey crew already setting reference points around the entrance road. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, forcing a calm tone that sounded much less certain than before. Daniel answered without emotion. "There is no misunderstanding. We are following recorded county monuments." He walked directly to the iron survey marker hidden beneath the grass beside the decorative stone wall. After cleaning the top with a small brush, he called the county officials over. They compared identification numbers against certified survey records, then nodded almost immediately. One official unfolded the original 1973 boundary map across the hood of his truck. The entrance road, the gate, the landscaping, the stone walls, and even the security booth all sat inside the Walker family recorded access easement. Every measurement confirmed exactly what my father had documented years earlier. Linda stood silently as the officials compared old surveys to modern satellite maps and current field measurements. There was no dramatic courtroom speech and no emotional confrontation. There did not need to be. Facts have a quiet confidence that opinions never possess. After reviewing the certified reports, one county official signed the verification paperwork while the deputy documented the inspection in his report. Rebecca calmly informed Linda that continued restriction of lawful access after official notice could expose the association to significant civil liability. For the first time since I had returned home, nobody referred to the entrance as community property. They called it what it had always been: private family access. The maintenance crews hired by the HOA arrived later expecting another ordinary workday. Instead, they received written instructions from the county advising that no additional work could continue within the disputed entrance until corrective action was completed. As I watched the morning sunlight fall across the old gravel lane beneath the towering oak tree, I realized my father had been right all along. People could build gates, install signs, and repeat the same story for years, but none of those things could move a property line that had never changed in the first place. The final changes happened quietly over the next several weeks, almost as if the land itself had been waiting for everyone to catch up with the truth. The temporary restrictions became permanent corrections after the county completed its review, and the recorded property boundaries were reaffirmed exactly as they had existed for decades. The decorative HOA sign disappeared from the entrance. The security booth was removed. The steel gate that had once stopped me from driving home was carefully relocated outside the Walker access easement, where it finally belonged. Nobody celebrated with speeches. Nobody needed to. The loudest sound that morning was the familiar crunch of my truck rolling down the gravel lane for the first time since my father passed away. Every bump in that road felt exactly the way I remembered. The farmhouse came into view slowly between rows of pecan trees, its white porch glowing beneath the Texas sun. I parked beside the old barn and stepped out into air filled with the comforting smell of cut hay, warm cedar, and fresh earth. The windmill still turned with the same steady rhythm it had carried through every season of my life. The old oak tree stood high above the pasture, untouched by every argument, every meeting, every polished presentation that had tried to rewrite the story of this place. I walked over and rested my hand against its rough bark, finding the small initials I carved there as a 12-year-old boy still hidden on the backside of the trunk. Time had stretched them wider, but they were still there. Just like the original survey markers. Just like the recorded deed. Just like the truth. A few days later, several neighbors stopped by one after another. Some apologized for believing rumors. Others admitted they had simply assumed the paperwork everyone talked about must have existed somewhere. I never blamed them. Assumptions spread faster than facts, especially when someone repeats them with confidence. Mrs. Helen Brooks brought over a peach pie the way she always had after every harvest season. Daniel Mercer dropped off a framed copy of the updated certified survey with a handwritten note that read, "Property lines do not care about opinions." Even Deputy Ryan Collins drove out one afternoon just to see the old entrance restored. He smiled as he looked down the gravel road and quietly said, "It finally looks the way I remember it." The greatest surprise came when I opened my father's notebook one last time before placing it back inside the hidden compartment in the workshop wall. Tucked between the final pages was another short note I had somehow missed. It simply read, "Son, if you ever have to choose between making noise and proving the truth, always choose the truth. Noise fades. Records remain." I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my wallet where it will stay for the rest of my life. Before sunset, I installed a simple wooden sign beside the entrance, built from reclaimed cedar that my father had stored inside the barn years ago. It read only 4 words. Walker Family Farm since 1961. No polished logo. No decorative stone pillars. No slogans. Just the name that had always belonged there. As I watched the last light settle across the fields, I finally understood what my father had been protecting all those years. He was never worried about losing the farm. He was making sure the truth would outlast anyone who ever tried to claim it. Justice is not loud. It does not rush. It does not need permission. It waits patiently, standing as firmly as an old oak tree, until the day the facts finally speak for themselves.